This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. This week, my guest is Max Olson, national college football writer from The Athletic. Max and I hit on a bunch of topics that are in the news this week, including where things stand on whether or not we're actually going to have a football season in the fall. Max and I try not to speculate too much. What we got into a lot of is the challenges of reporting relevant information when there is so much uncertainty. We also talk football. TCU signed a 5-star tailback who had a very unusual recruitment. Rutgers landed a transfer quarterback from Nebraska. Tennessee is cleaning up on the recruiting trail, and Jim Harbaugh has some radical ideas. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is Max Olson from The Athletic, resident of, actually, you're back in Nebraska, but are you in Lincoln or Omaha?
Lincoln, Nebraska.
You are
That's
in
correct.
Lincoln. Remind me, did you grow up in Lincoln?
Grew up in Lincoln.
Okay.
From the age of 6 all the way through college. Went to Nebraska. And then we went down to Austin for 7 years and absolutely loved it, but made sense to, as we're getting to the end of our 20s here, made sense to come back home. Austin was a hell of a place to spend our 20s, though. I promise you that. Yeah,
Austin's a great 20s city, and Lincoln strikes me as being a little more of an adult city.
Slightly more affordable, yes.
Yes, in many ways. So we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation here, but I've tried to make this podcast something where we don't get too bogged down in the virus and the pandemic, except to provide occasionally some news updates that are relevant to college sports. I haven't done that in the last couple of weeks. I feel like now's a good time. I feel like there's been a fair amount of newsy things around college sports and related to the pandemic over the last week or so. But actually, I just want to almost start with this. I'll throw this out to you. Have you found it challenging to report and to be engaged in the reporting of how this will play out? Because I think we are obligated to try to get some information to the public on how it might play out, how it will play out over the next couple of months as far as football season and college sports going forward. But I also find myself thinking it's so speculative. Do I want to constantly be sort of throwing ifs and ands and buts and having this and quoting different people saying the same thing all the time? So I'm wondering how you've engaged as a reporter or even as a reader, as a consumer, with the reporting around how things will play out with the college football season.
And you've done a great job of covering this so far. Wouldn't you agree that this has been just the day-to-day of this has been pretty head-spinning at times?
Yes, and it's the hardest challenge is when to enter the day-to-day and to say, listen, I don't know if this is moving the ball. Like, I don't know if we need to report another person, another AD or another commissioner saying something slightly different. That's been the biggest challenge for me.
Well, that's the thing. It's like, by the time we're done, like, taping this podcast, like we could probably dig into like where things stand as of Wednesday morning. But things might be completely different by Thursday morning, and that's the thing that's especially this week feels a little crazy, is just sort of the day-to-day trickle of different bodies and groups and conferences saying things or making decisions is just so all over the place right now. And in a way that it gets a little bit confusing because you're wondering, you certainly can understand why conferences and schools are having to like address their budget problems, immediately. You understand that part of it. But some of this, when you start talking about landing on decisions for the fall as of mid-May, it still seems a little bit jarring when there's just still so much we don't know, and you certainly assume that ultimately these decisions will be made based on the best information you have available to you at the time, which you would think is later in time. But it's with our sport that we cover, it's a mess, man. It's crazy to try and keep track and follow and cover because, like, at the NBA. We're seeing that play out right now too, and it's pretty straightforward with the NBA. I know there's a lot of parties involved, but at the end of the day, the NBA has a commissioner and they have a players union, and those two sides will basically work out whatever the compromise is. Like with college athletics, I mean, who's the boss? You know what I mean? And it's not just the issues between Mark Emmert and the autonomy leagues, which you saw rise up when it came time to make a decision with with March Madness. But ultimately, you're also talking about the status of universities, and you're talking about what will each of these states and state governments allow you to do. So it's really impossible. If anyone tells you exactly, they know exactly how this is going to play out, I think they're full of it at this point.
Yeah, I think what you try to do is provide information that will give insight to the public on how decisions are being made and who is making those decisions. And again, I'm not saying I'm perfect at it. It's hard. And because of all the things that you're saying, I think it would be inevitable. And this is not me being a cynic. I think it's inevitable that whatever we come up with, whatever happens in the fall or maybe this winter and spring, is going to be messy for all the reasons that you're laying out and for all the reasons that we've seen as we've sort of covered this over the last few weeks and really a few months now. I don't think there is any way we will have anything. I mean, of course, it's not going to look normal, right? I mean, there's no way where this is going to look normal. But the idea that this won't be a little messy, maybe at times uncomfortable, and maybe unsatisfying, I just don't know how you can avoid that. But that doesn't mean we can't still have a football season and actually still be able to get some enjoyment and joy out of it. I just think we have to be I just talking to an AD today, and he was like, listen, we just got to have very thick skin because things are not going to go well. And when there are going to be points when something goes poorly, and when that happens, we're going to take a lot of hits on it.
I've said this before to folks, that we work with. I really feel strongly at some point in time, they're going to make, if hypothetically people move forward with a fall season, if they're going to make a plan based on the best information that they have, and that plan might be flat out wrong, right? And we're all just going to have to kind of cross our fingers that nothing disastrous happens that forces that to be, totally rejected and canceled, right? And it feels it's hard to talk about this stuff because it's hard to sort of know, like, are we talking about the right things with this stuff, right? I mean, because there's obviously there's the structure of, what would a season look like? When would it be? Who all is committed to playing in it and all that stuff. But then there's also the very real problem that we're going to have to figure out of, well, okay, if we try to go forward with something, how is everybody getting tested? How are we doing this in a safe way? And what happens when inevitably somebody gets sick?
Mm-hmm. Right. And then the trickle and the ripple effect of that becomes, can that team play? Then the teams that team has played play? What happens if the team can't play to the team it's supposed to play? Right? Well, I mean, I'm not laughing because this is funny. I'm laughing because it's crazy.
The reality is we saw it in the spring, right? That once Rudy Gobert tested positive, then everyone realized, oh crap, we got to put this whole thing on pause, and you wonder, how would college football respond if that day comes in and they're trying to put a season together. But also, I'm curious for your thoughts on the thing that I think it feels like we're talking about a lot more this week, and that is this real fascinating problem of when it comes to making these decisions, can these things be done in a uniform way, or is it just going to be an extreme amount of splintering?
I suspect it might be more uniform than maybe we are even giving credit for, because I think everybody's motivated. It really is in everybody's best interest to have some uniformity.
And cooperate with each other.
And to
certainly.
cooperate. Yeah, it's in everybody's best interest. So I think that simply because it's in your best interest, you will try to make it out that way. So I think that there's a possibility that it could be more I think that after this past week or so, it's very easy to say, man, it is just going to be a free-for-all. We're just going to have, the Pac-12 is not going to play at all, and the SEC is going to start on Labor Day, and just but you realize
these schools just canceled these games, and they got to find all these non-conference matchups and all that kind. Yeah, it could get really out of hand.
And then there's also, and again, talking to a conversation I had with an AD, it's like, what are you playing for if you're just playing by yourself, to a certain degree, and how much can you salvage? But I don't know. I think when there is motivation to do something, it is more likely that it will happen. I always go back to I'm a big baseball fan, right? If you're motivated to trade somebody, most likely you're going to trade that guy, right? If you're really motivated, or even in college football, if you're motivated to fire your coach, you will fire your coach. If you're motivated to keep your coach, you will find reasons to keep your coach. So I think that there's enough motivation to find a uniform solution that it makes it a decent chance that they will. But I just worry about the idea, what you're talking about, that it falls apart as the season goes along. That, and this, again, I don't want to
we don't even really have time to go down that road because there's still so much that has to get solved before August.
Yeah. And that's why I think the season itself has a chance to be very muddied and messy, because I think inevitably there will be issues within it. And again, I'm not a virus expert, so I don't want to slide into that kind of conversation. But it just, one of the things I'm sort of bracing for when I talk to some experts, including one who lives in my house, is that we will make some missteps along the way that set us back, that we see some progress here, and that the setbacks will affect, what we hope to be a college football season. I know that's pretty minor in the grand scheme of things, but, sports are important, and they show a sense of normalcy, and they give us something to do while we're sitting at home. So they're not completely unimportant. But I just worry about I think that there's this sense around the country of we might be past it. But when you talk to the experts, they tell you, no, we're not. So what happens if we slide back? So I don't know. We have no answers here, but I just do think that there's, again, an inevitability that this will be messy.
Yeah, well, and I think, part of what makes this, just so dizzying to try to keep track of on a daily basis is that I think there is a lot of truth to, I think just as we saw in March, probably is important for you and me to also be keeping an eye on what's going on with Major League Baseball and what's going on with the NBA, because I think there's probably, somebody in pro sports is going to have to kind of take the lead on this thing and be the canary in the coal mine, unfortunately, and try to launch their sport and figure out best practices and how well that goes, and the solutions they find probably will inform what college football feels comfortable with doing in September, and if that isn't possible, then I think that unfortunately I think it makes it look a little more gloomy for our sport.
Yeah, we'll cross our fingers and see where we go. I don't know if we moved the ball at all on that, but I figured it was worth having that conversation on here because it seemed like
I think people need to hear how exasperated we are about trying to report on this stuff, because it's just the reality, man. It's just. Well, I wish I could give everybody a really, definitive, confident answer about this stuff, but there's just thousands of factors,
Mm-hmm. Hey, so let's talk a little about football. And you wrote about this week. I figure if there's one reporter, national college football writer, who has seen Zach Evans play football, and Zach Evans is a 5-star recruit. He's basically the last major piece of the 2020 recruiting class that signed. Mm-hmm. He had a roller coaster signing or recruiting period, and he signed with TCU earlier this week, and he is a stud from what everybody says. I have never, I've only seen maybe a YouTube highlight or so, but he's a big deal, and he landed at TCU, and it was a long and winding road for him to get there. So you wrote a little bit about him and how he ended up at TCU. Give us a little idea of, again, his long and winding road and how good is this guy?
Yeah, the Zach Evans story, it's one of those where it's like, how much time you got, because it's quite a tale from start to finish here. This is a kid who really has been on the recruiting radar for 3 years now, or maybe longer. A kid that very early on in his high school career at North Shore out in Houston, it was, the hype started really early for him, with people saying that he might be, the best running back prospect to come out of the state of Texas since Adrian Peterson. And so he's had to kind of wear that reputation for years here. And that has created, a lot of interest in where he was going, and, going into, coming out of his junior year, had a great season. North Shore wins the state title, just a super talented player, a kid who really had all these options in front of him. This is a kid who went through a very, very long recruitment, and a lot of people probably, assumed he would go to Texas A&M or Texas. But he kind of played the recruiting games. He was linked to LSU at one point, to Alabama, to A&M, never did commit, put out his list and kind of played some games with that stuff. And ultimately a bunch of these schools backed off because, there were, some, not a little bit of red flags in just the recruitment of the maturity of Zach, but all kids kind of do that at that age anyway. But the senior season at North Shore, there were a bunch of issues. He got suspended for 2 games early on in his season for disciplinary issues. He showed up at halftime of one of his playoff games in high school, and said he was taking the ACT that morning, so that's why he couldn't play in the first half of his playoff game. And then of course shows up and rushes for 176 yards and 2 touchdowns because he's just that good. But the big red flag was that for the state title game at North Shore had a big rematch with Duncanville, and he was sent home from the state title game, wasn't allowed to play in it because he feuded with his coaches. They asked him to turn over his cell phone like all of his other teammates do at curfew the night before the game, and he refused to do it, and he fought with them and got sent home. And so this happened a few days after he secretly signed with Georgia during the early signing period, right? And he was planning to announce his that he was going to Georgia as an early enrollee at the Under Armour All-American game on January 2nd. Right. And the night before that's
a common thing that is starting now.
Sure, it's a common thing to sit on that and announce it on national TV, right. And then he was going to go over to Georgia. And the night before that, he finds out that he needs to cancel his announcement because Georgia was having second thoughts, and Georgia ultimately backed off, and Zach Evans got his release from Georgia on January 7th to go wherever he wants. And he did also, this is a young man who's had some things going on in his life too. He cited that his grandmother, who's a really important figure in his life, was really ill, and he wanted to stay closer to home. And so I think that was a factor ultimately in choosing to go to TCU. But this is a kid who's been kind of stuck ever since January. He's been kind of stuck. It's been very quiet. No one's really known where he was going to end up. And this is he took official visits to Tennessee, and he took one to Ole Miss, and he was going to go check out Florida before the coronavirus shut everything down. And then, out of the blue on Monday morning, he has enrolled in online classes at TCU. TCU offered him in February 2018, and he has never once talked about TCU. I'm not even sure if he's visited TCU. They never made his list of his top schools. So it was a complete curveball, but one that kind of makes sense for how unpredictable this thing went for Zach Evans. And it's a fascinating ending. Never would have really seen that coming. It's the first 5-star high school signee in TCU history. And you hope that going there and having that structure with that program with Gary Patterson, maybe that can kind of give him the structure and discipline he needs to kind of get things back on track and really have a really productive career there. You hope the best for him.
Yeah, listen, I think it's fair to be a little skeptical and to think, okay, maybe he ended up at TCU because a lot of other places just bailed on him.
Right.
Clearly, Georgia did. Right? I mean, so I think I think it's fair to play that out to maybe some other bigger schools that sort of say, you know what, kid, we have a lot of 4 or 5 star options here, so we don't. Which tends to be the way this works, and this is removed from Zach Evans and. When you see sometimes it's not uncommon for when you see a highly recruited player end up a little farther away from what you consider the elite schools, even though he was a player who could probably compete at the elite schools. Yep. A lot of times there is some type of red flag attached to them because the elite schools go, wait a second, we have our choice of blue chippers. We don't necessarily need to deal with your red flags. So, to a certain degree, that could be to TCU's benefit. Again, this sounds like a player who has a chance to be an All-American, leave early, the type of back that really makes a huge impact, and maybe even early on. Of course, what kind of impact freshmen are going to make early on is an interesting question around the country because all those early enrollees, while they may have gotten to campus on time, and obviously Evans would have been one but wasn't, but now even all those early enrollees and the guys, one of the things that's great about the early enrollee process and the summer, once those kids are in, that's been one of the reasons why freshmen make such a big impact. I have no idea what that's going to look like this year.
I'm totally with you. And the Evans one is fascinating because, since he was supposed to be an early enrollee, he kind of hasn't really been doing anything from January till now. I think he's been training and kind of laying low. So you're certainly curious kind of what kind of shape he would be in right now. You're curious when would he even be able to arrive on the campus in Fort Worth there. And this is a guy who I think this coaching staff is going to have to really keep a close eye on and really give him a lot of support and a lot of help. And there's probably going to be, I've covered Gary Patterson for a long time. There definitely could be times when he ends up in the doghouse there because it's, Gary Patterson is not the easiest guy to play for. His players love him, but it's. He runs a strict program. And so I'm really interested to see how that fit works out. And it's a really interesting opportunity for TCU to get an elite player like that into their program. They've continued to produce first-round picks. They had 2 this year with Jalen Reagor and Jeff Gladney. And then, Ross Blacklock was also a top 40 pick. They've churned out NFL guys, but even in joining the Big 12, they haven't really had that many 4-star kids from the state of Texas come to TCU. Only like 14 in 8 years. And so getting a guy like Zach Evans is definitely going to get the attention of kids in the Houston area that, wow, if you can go be just as successful in staying closer to home at TCU, that could really open some doors for that program. If Zach Evans, takes this opportunity seriously and really gets things together here and handles his business. So you really hope it works out and you could see why Gary Patterson and his staff would roll the dice on this one. Let's
go to a world where the season starts on time and everything is sort of relatively normal.
I love it.
TCU was not, I've said this on this podcast before, but I'll say it to you. TCU was not much different last year than Baylor. They were a similar team, but TCU had none of the breaks. Baylor caught a few breaks. Baylor had a transcendent season where it went to the Sugar Bowl. TCU didn't even make a bowl game because that's sort of the way things are in the Big 12. The line between having a breakout season and having a season where you end up not making a bowl game is pretty thin. It could be just the difference of a couple of injuries, a couple of close games, and quarterback play. Baylor had a lot of health, some good fortune in close games, and a pretty decent, for the most part, until later in the year, and some pretty decent play at quarterback, whereas TCU, that all blew up. So they can't control the injuries and the close games. To a certain extent, you can't control that, but you can control the quarterback stuff. I mean, if you just have competent quarterback play on that TCU team last year, it probably makes a big difference. Where might that come from this year?
Yeah, it's It's interesting. TCU just has not been that great over the last two seasons. I'm excluding, of course, the Cheez-It Bowl against Cal, which is an all timer. Of course, we all remember that fondly.
Right.
But last season, even with all the NFL talent they had a true freshman quarterback in Max Duggan who had some ups and downs. He did beat Texas and did give them a chance in some games, but TCU lost a bunch of games that you'd be surprised that they lose them last year, based on just the talent they had coming back. And I was surprised that it came down to the end there, and then losing to a West Virginia team that also didn't go to a bowl in their finale to not be able to go to a bowl game there. So while they played, they beat Texas and they played Baylor really close and they played Oklahoma really close and played K-State close. They had some nice moments, but this is a team that can absolutely use an injection of Zach Evans, especially after losing their two senior running backs, Darius Anderson and Shewa Olonilua. So it's an interesting time for TCU. They brought Doug Meacham back onto their staff actually to help Sonny Cumbie again, which I think is a really interesting choice. There was some speculation that maybe they would be making an OC change, and Gary Patterson stuck with Cumbie and brought Meacham back, which I think is I can't wait to see how that works again, because you saw how well that worked with Trevon Boykin back in the day. But I think you're right. I think that's true of the Big 12, that you're going to get stuck in a lot of close games, and a lot of times it's going to come down to your quarterback play. And they're sticking with Max Duggan, but he's got to get better.
We're going to take a quick break here on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast with Max Olson, national college football writer from The Athletic. Be back and do a little Tennessee. They've been hot on the recruiting trail. Jim Harbaugh gave us some content fodder last week. And there was actually a transfer in your backyard, out of your backyard, that happened today that I want to ask you about. We'll be back with Max Olson from The Athletic right after this.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Max Olson, national college football writer from The Athletic. So let's start in your backyard, because, we actually had some transfer news today. There's still transferring going on. These kids are doing it without really knowing a whole lot about these schools that they're landing at. So good luck and God bless them. So Noah Vedral is now a two-time transfer. He was a quarterback at UCF. He followed Scott Frost from UCF to Nebraska, and now is getting out of Nebraska and decided to go play across the Big Ten at Rutgers. That he made that announcement a few hours before we started taping here. Give me a little rundown on Vedral and what this sort of means for Nebraska. I guess what it means for Nebraska is not a lot of depth.
Yeah, it's interesting. Nebraska felt like they were in tremendous shape with their quarterback room, in 2019 and what they've built there. But when you have a bunch of qualified guys there, then somebody, everybody's going to want a chance to start. And for Noah Vedral, the fact that he lost out on the chance to go through spring ball and really push Adrian Martinez for the starting job made him think, all right, this is a kid who felt like he was ready to be a starter. And just knew he really was he'd lost that chance to compete for it at Nebraska this spring. So he put his name in the portal to see what's out there. This is a kid who, Husker fans have a lot of affection for. There were definitely times last season when Adrian Martinez struggled and people wanted to see Noah Vedral in the game to see what he could do. Really, really smart, bright kid, really understands the offense. He was definitely an asset for Nebraska, even in his limited playing time for him. And I think he's gonna have a chance to. I don't see why he wouldn't be the front runner now to start for Rutgers. I think he fits what Sean Gleason would want to do offensively. He comes with that experience from the UCF and Nebraska offense of he knows how to get it out quickly, and I don't think the transition is going to be tough for him at Rutgers. And that quarterback room at Rutgers is obviously more than a bit unproven. So I think as a grad transfer, he'd go there and really have a good opportunity to really show what he wanted to show at Nebraska and never totally got a chance to do. And I think Gleason was a great hire for Rutgers, and I think he's going to make them fun offensively. And Vedral could be a good guy to get that thing going.
Yeah, fun eventually. Well, and the part of the thing with Rutgers is you're right, the quarterback room needed some help, but I also think you have a certain amount of shell shock in that quarterback room. I like Artur Sitkowski. There may be a player in there. That might be a player that you could work with, but I also don't know if after coming off of last season there is much left to work with. I just think some of the players who have been through there have been through so much bad that if nothing else, I think what you needed was an injection of somebody who could provide some hope and optimism who hasn't sort of been through the ringer.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's funny, so when Noah Vedral transferred from UCF to Nebraska, it was just as Scott Frost and their quarterback coach Mario Verduzco and those guys got to Lincoln. So he shows up and he basically helped teach the quarterback room the offense, even though he was the new guy. And I think that's probably how it could be at Rutgers too, because he probably will be able to pick up on what they're doing really quickly. And he might just be a guy that helps make Rutgers quarterback room better because of his experience. And, he's just a really, really bright, ahead of his years kind of kid. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up in coaching at some point. And yeah, you're right. The Rutgers quarterback room has been through it for the past few years. So I think a kid like this, they obviously have brought in transfers over the years with very, very mixed success. But I could see, obviously, it's not the ideal time to be making a transfer. But I could see this working out for Rutgers.
So the other thing that's becoming more prevalent is the Tom Savage plan, which is the multiple transfer, especially at quarterbacks. I think of Luke Starkel. I think is now on his third
Nick
team.
Starkel.
Nick
Yes.
Starkel. I'm sorry. Nick
Yes.
Starkel is now on, I believe, his third team going the A&M, Arkansas, I believe San Jose State now.
That's correct. That's correct.
And this is becoming, again, a little more prominent, I think, because what ends up happening is, well, there's a couple of reasons. Obviously, you have waivers, you have the ability to grad transfer. You also have the ability to grad transfer more than once. We talk about early enrollees. These kids are coming in early. They're graduating in 2 years, basically.
Right.
So they're
Right.
leaving a school with 2 or 3, like Joe Burrow, for example, with 2 or 3 years left of eligibility. So now they can grad transfer more than once. And listen, it's at points like that when you sort of understand why coaches maybe are a little worried about all this transferring and all the loosening of the transfer rules. And if we get a one-time exception and a grad transfer option, so kids could one-time exception and then grad transfer, maybe not, that might change. But you're already seeing this multiple transfer thing. And again, it's at points like this you can understand why coaches go, is this really what we want to be doing? Of course, listen, I support the kids having a lot of freedom, but you can definitely find yourself thinking is this really the way we want to go here?
Yeah, no, this is totally the plan now for quarterbacks. And I think probably their high school coaches and their parents get it, that this is sort of how you have to plan it out now, is you come in as an early enrollee and you try to get your degree in 2.5 years, basically by the end of your second year in the program. And so the fact that there are some really sharp kids that are capable of doing that, it's wild, but that you have to kind of do that, not just to try and, obviously it's smart to do that to try and, chase your master's and all sorts of stuff while you're still in college, but it also gives you an out after 2 years if it hasn't gone exactly the way you thought it would, if you haven't been the starter, or if you've been the starter and you've lost your job or gotten hurt or whatever. I think you look at, I studied this back on signing day, just the number of top 50 quarterbacks that actually make it past that second year is a pretty small number. And the ones that do are the ones that end up being the 3 and 4 year starters. So if it doesn't work out for you early on, kids are going to move on.
Yeah, Zach Barrett from Football Scoop did the research on a thing that I was sort of toying around in my head, and I noticed that he had actually done the work for me to a certain degree. And he was talking about basically, if you looked at the start of last season, most teams are starting a freshman, a player who started as a freshman, or a transfer. That's basically so. Basically, if you're not starting by your sophomore year, if you look at your sophomore year, either heading into the season or at some point, I would say by the spring of your sophomore year, if you were a quarterback and you look around the room and you say, boy, I'm not going to be first string this year, I'm probably not. This is probably not working out for me at this school. And that sounds crazy. And again, I know coaches will cringe and maybe even some fans will cringe, but the way the machine is moving now, again, you're starting your freshman, you're starting a kid who started as a freshman, and that's the thing with the schools too. If they have players who they're not sold on by sophomore year, they're going into the market. So it's not a two-way street here. If you get to spring and you have a room full of guys that you've been around for about 2 years, you may all of a sudden have already made the decision that we can do better.
Well, and not to mention that, and then random bad luck happens too. I mean, you look at JT Daniels is in the portal right now, and he starts as a freshman. You get hurt as a sophomore, so now he's a redshirt freshman in eligibility who's already in the portal and looking to make a move. And would, if there's a one-time exception, then would have potentially an opportunity, if this had been approved, to go be a starter somewhere. In your third year right away. I mean, there's been a bunch of Felipe Franks was going to be a guy that probably would have played out the whole time at Florida. He gets hurt, he moves on. Jacob Eason losing his job at Georgia. There's just also a bunch of these guys that it does work out for them, and then one bad break, one injury, then you got to go.
And their presence, the Felipe Franks, the JT Daniels, the Jacob Easons, when that type of player ends up in the portal, again, that's when the schools that are in need, or Jamie Newman, when the schools that have some need will go, well, wait a second. I may like the guy I recruited, but I like that guy a lot better.
Exactly.
So that's a domino that falls. So then that kid that was at the school, I don't know what Georgia's depth chart is, but I imagine there's at least one or two kids at Georgia that saw Jamie Newman step onto campus and thought, what am I doing here? Right? and that will be the case when Noah Vedral arrives at Rutgers. And again, Rutgers had a quarterback.
What do you think the backups did at Ohio State when Justin Fields got to town?
That's right. Justin Fields cleared the room. So that happens too. And again, when the presence, so Keaton Slovis winning that job at USC pushes JT Daniel out the door. And now there's going to be a school that's going to look at JT Daniel and that has a full quarterback room and still think he's better than what I got. I'm going with that kid.
I mean, it's a 5-star kid with low, 1 season of mileage on him, basically. Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing with this, and I think that's probably what excites and scares coaches about the possibility of this. Being a one-time transfer exception world is you never know who might pop up there, and if a Justin Fields comes onto the market, and if that starts happening more frequently, there's definitely no loyalty with the guys you got.
So let's hit on a couple more topics here, and one of them is Tennessee is on fire on the recruiting trail. Now, our Bud Elliott, threw a little cold water on Tennessee's hot streak by sort of pointing out that, Tennessee's recruiting rankings, if you go like per player average, not quite as far up on the top of the list. They have a ton of commits now, and that helps your recruiting average. And right now, I think they're sitting like right behind Ohio State as like number 2 in the country. Nonetheless, Jeremy Pruitt's doing some pretty damn good work, and they've had some big-time players, guys who were 4- and 5-star players who absolutely would have been in the mix at the Ohio States, Georgias, and Alabamas and Clemsons of the world, decide that they were going to jump on board with Tennessee. Butch Jones had some good recruiting success, and it didn't really work out. If I asked you, why should we be more optimistic about this Tennessee turn than we have in the past when we've tried to be optimistic about Tennessee's upswing?
Yeah, this is really interesting what they've done so far. Now, part of being the number 2 class in the country is they've already got 21 commits on board, so they got more commits than anybody, and that
sheer volume
ranking,
helps.
Obviously,
sheer volume
absolutely helps, and obviously there's so many commitments going on a daily basis right now because coaches are working their butts off every day in the Twitter DMs and FaceTimes and all that because they've got plenty of time to do so. And kids are sitting at home they're bored and they're can't go take these visits. So hey, may as well just make a commitment. So will there be? I've seen a bunch of people bracing for there just being a ton of decommitments this fall, and will that affect this Tennessee class? I guess I don't know. We'll see, but it's there's a couple pieces of this. First of all, it's a reminder of what a short memory kids have when it comes to this stuff because. Where were we last September on Jeremy Pruitt, Ralph?
Yeah, I mean, right.
It was like
2 weeks into the season,
horrific loss away from it being game over, right? And so
yeah.
the Vols did. I feel like they did just enough last season. And if you want to go through like the game by game of who they beat to get to 8 wins, wait, is it 8 wins or 9 wins?
I think they went to 8 with a bowl win. 8 with
a bowl win.
Yeah,
okay.
Indiana got them to 8.
That's right. You can go through that and maybe like squint your eyes a little bit at some of the teams they beat in having that good finish. But clearly they did. Yeah, that's right. They won 6 in a row to finish. Clearly they did just enough to sort of help create this perception among kids that this thing is now pointing in the right direction, that Tennessee is not dealing with that instability that they've had for these past few years, that they've really had to fight the perception on. But I also remember, like, before, when Jeremy Pruitt got the job, I remember when we were down in Atlanta for the national title game, Alabama, Georgia, and like you would talk to some of those veteran players on that Alabama team, like Rashaan Evans, and those guys talked about Jeremy Pruitt in the same breath as they did Kirby Smart, just as a coach and as a recruiter, and certainly as a recruiter. So you look at his coaching staff; it's full of guys that can recruit their asses off. So I'm not surprised that once this thing got on some solid ground, that he would really get rolling in recruiting. Now the question is, can you win enough games to kind of, you're selling the future here. You're selling some hope here. You now have to win enough games to make kids think that that's reality.
Right, because this one class is not enough to turn around your program. They have some talent there. They showed that they could compete, but you add a team that has some talent and maybe can compete, and you add a really great freshman class, but if you have another mediocre or worse season, you lose a lot of that momentum, and maybe there's a window where that great freshman class can get you to a good season. But, again, in the SEC, one good class is not enough. You'll quickly fall behind.
Even when these kids commit, you're still going to end up, battling Georgia and LSU and Alabama and Auburn and all of your familiar foes to hold on to those kids. So you've got to stack some wins to make these kids really feel convinced that they made the right call.
That's a really good point too. And Tennessee has also got, they play Alabama every year. They have the misfortune of having to play Alabama every year. They have a trip. I think it's a trip to Norman this year. I know they've got Oklahoma.
Going to Norman week 2.
Yeah, they have the brutal schedule of Oklahoma, Florida, and Georgia, because that's their normal, and Alabama, all sitting there waiting for them. They do get lucky and they play Arkansas on the other side of the division, as opposed to, let's say, an LSU or a Texas A&M, which would be much better. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see where they move forward this year as far as, taking the leap from last year. Now, listen, I imagine they will probably do a little better against the Charlotte 49ers than they did against Georgia State in their opener. But
I'm looking at the schedule here. They have to go to Troy on November 21st.
No. That's in Neyland. That's in Neyland.
Oh, it's in Neyland? Oh, I'm sorry. That's it. Yes, you're right. That's it. That. What am I saying? Of course not. Yeah, Troy, November 21st. That's a nice little trap, though.
Yes, that's an odd time because I know, right, a lot of the SEC teams, they like to put that FB, that low level FBS, that bye game in November. But that's an interesting team to slot there because that's generally a pretty tough team. Usually, you want to go a couple of rungs down if you're going to
get them right after Georgia, where you're going to get beat up. It's an interesting schedule for Tennessee.
Yeah.
And that Oklahoma game, I certainly would love to see it. I think that'd be fascinating.
Yeah,
especially with Oklahoma breaking in a new quarterback.
Right, and Tennessee still has a lot of work to do as far as sorting out who their quarterback will be. But yeah, for some reason this feels different, and it feels like maybe this is something that could be built on long term. But again, I've been burned before. We've all sort of had thought, oh, maybe this is the point where Tennessee comes back, and it's been. I think I looked, it was almost 20 years since Tennessee has had a double-digit win season. So at this point, you're going to have to show me. You're going to have to prove it. I'll believe you're back when I see you're back.
And you look at their commit list here. They've got the number 1 recruit in the state of Alabama, Dylan Brooks, a defensive end committed to their class. Trust me, there's going to be a fight to hold on to those kind of guys the rest of the way.
Okay, so now let's talk about Jim Harbaugh, who amid all the coronavirus stuff and whether we're going to play and all that very difficult stuff to report out, which has kept us busy. What Jim Harbaugh provided us was just good old content, good old talk radio. Let's throw this out, this off-season topic out there. Like, this would have been perfect in a normal off-season. Jim Harbaugh sends an open letter to anybody who wants to hear it, that he has all these great ideas about players entering the draft whenever they want. College football players transferring pretty much whenever they want, with the one-time exception. But the main point was the draft stuff. The idea that college football players should not be restricted to having to wait until after 3 years into his career to enter the draft. College football players should be allowed to enter the draft whenever they want, and if not drafted, they should be allowed to come back. Now, the NFL has a say in almost all of that. so it's not a realistic plan and something that can happen. But let's chew it over as if it was a normal offseason. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that piece of the proposal, the NFL draft stuff, with letting players go in whenever they want and letting them come back if they. What did he say? Was it if you're not the first 6 rounds?
Yeah, I think it was 240th pick, I believe it was.
Okay. I think to me that kind of falls in the category of like, that would be cool in an ideal world if that were possible. You know what I mean? Because I think, like, I've written a lot over the last couple of years about the problem of just the number of underclassmen that get bad advice and go into the NFL draft and go really late or go undrafted. It's we get the same number pretty much every year. 30% of the underclassmen that go into the draft go undrafted, and I'm certain a lot of those 30%. Probably should go back to school or wish they could go back to school. So I love the idea of them being able to go back. But when you actually talk to coaches about the logistics of that, it's tricky. I mean, so first of all, this idea is we're basically kind of borrowing ideas from the NBA, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to do. Yep.
The tough thing is the 85 scholarship limit, because like, if you were to play out the Jim Harbaugh fantasy, I think it would make a lot of sense that players should also then be able to, go to the NFL Combine, and after the Combine come back to school if they're not getting the feedback they think that they should be getting. The problem is you have to sign a recruiting class to fill those holes, and then you have guys showing up either before, in my world where they come back after the Combine, you have guys showing up at the start of spring ball, or after the draft, you have guys showing up after spring ball. I don't know how you account for that and plan for that and keep, stay at or under the 85 limit when you've got to replace those guys, probably with transfers in a lot of cases, and then those guys end up coming back to you. So I don't really totally know how that works, the timing of that stuff. But I don't want to poo-poo it because I kind of would like to see it. Wouldn't you?
Oh, I would. And not only the 85 limit, but the 25 limit. And this bridges into or crosses into a conversation we're having about the transfer rules changing and how it's going to be necessary to also tweak the 25 signee cap per season.
You have to relax that. Yeah,
there has to be some kind of some mechanism to say, if you lose a transfer, you get to add a transfer. Even if you've signed 25, if you lose some players, we're going to give you some leeway here to replace those players through transfers, not only because it's good for the team, but because it's also very good for the players. Because as you've written about and others have talked, the portal is filling up and there's not enough spots for these kids. Correct. Even now. Because again, you can only sign 25. So even if I have less than 85 total on my roster, I may have already signed my limit for this year, so I can't go back and fill those spots. So they need to do some adjusting on those things, and you would absolutely need to do it if you were to let kids come back from exploring their draft, the NFL possibilities, and then you need to have the ability to do it even farther. Like you'd be asking teams to sort of hold spaces or not even hold space. Well, I guess to a certain degree you might, right? If you're a team, you might decide, you know what? Okay, who's in the draft this year? I identify 15 kids that I think will be coming back, right? Because you'll do your homework, right? You'll make your phone calls and you'll try to figure out through, back channels, hey, how serious you think this kid is about staying in the draft, right? So if you're a coach that, you might think, okay, I've identified 10 or 15 kids or maybe even 5 kids that I really like. And if they come back, you know what? I'm going to hold the scholarship open for that. But how long? Yeah. Now you're talking about doing it into the spring. Like after spring practice, it just becomes a very different type of roster management. Now, I would also say, hey, man, you're making $4 million a year. Deal with it. It might be interesting to see how it plays out. It would be really interesting and fun. But I also understand that there are limitations to that, or there are problems inherent with that maybe, who knows. And also, what are the unintended consequences of that?
Well, I mean, and you've seen the last couple of years here, the way that college basketball players declare for the NBA draft is like really strange now, where they announce they're entering the draft, but in most cases they end up pulling out, right? And so
without an agent?
I don't think the college football world wants any part of that. I think Nick Saban would be pretty upset if he had suddenly twice as many guys declaring that they want to explore where they're at in the draft, and then decide to come back later on and miss spring ball and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So there's elements of that are interesting, but at the same time, like there's definitely some truth to what Jim Harbaugh is aiming for here, and I think over the years, I think it's a very natural thing we talk about all the time, Ralph. Well, why should Myles Garrett have to play another season? Why should Trevor Lawrence have to play another season? There's not a lot of cases. When you talk about guys going pro earlier than 3 years, there's not a lot of cases every year where you feel like, that oh yeah, this guy's a no-brainer first rounder, even if he didn't have that extra season. But there's enough of them that it's worth having that conversation.
Yes, without question. I mean, we've been talking about Trevor Lawrence and how he probably would have been a first-round draft pick 2 years ago, and Jadeveon Clowney, basically, practically coming out of high school, looked like a guy who might have been a high draft pick, right? I mean, again, they're rare. They're getting less rare because of the nature of development of high school football players and just evolution. Quite frankly, like these kids are entering college bigger, stronger, and more well developed than ever before. So I think it's fair to start looking at that and having that conversation. The other element of this is, of course, is the NFL side of it, not just because it's the NFL's call, but listen, the NFL has decided that it's just not going to pay for what it gets for free, right? It's not going to pay to develop its players because it doesn't need to pay to develop its players. I think you can make an argument about the ethics of that, quite frankly. I really do. I think you can make an argument about the ethics of running a business that is so dangerous and not paying people to be developed and trained for your business, right? And having that done for free. But I also understand I'm a capitalist myself, so I also understand that there's no business model that says you should start paying for something that you can get for free. Like that's
which is how we lead to this clash we now have with college basketball and the NBA and the these fat G League offers and all that stuff. Well, you're right. You said from the start, it definitely would take a lot of cooperation, collaboration between the NFL and the Power Five or autonomy or whoever you want to call it that makes these kind of decisions to set something like that up.
The NBA is realizing it's in their best interest to get into the market because they already experienced this. They understand that there are kids who can go from high school to the pros, and it makes sense for the NBA to get these kids in a development system because they're probably only a year away from being able to contribute at the highest level. And, of course, there's also not that many of them. You only need 15 guys on an NBA roster, and really only about 10 of those guys have to be able to play. So it makes sense for the NBA to enter this market more. It makes a lot less sense for the NFL to do it. The one argument I had always heard, I don't live in the NFL world very much, unlike some of our colleagues like Bruce Feldman or Pete Thamel, who sort of have good contacts in both worlds, the NFL and college. I don't live that much in the NFL world, but I remember a couple of years ago somebody telling me like he thought that there was probably more momentum towards having some type of developmental league than ever before because coaches were just getting very frustrated with the players that they were getting from college.
Yeah.
Now, I would also say, like, Maybe that's because you're not smart enough to use them the way they were used in college, and we're seeing a lot more of that now. So it was a lot of people who are like shaking their fist, and why can't he drop back, and why doesn't this guy run block the way I want him to do, as opposed to saying, well, we know what he can do because of what he's been doing in college. We're just going to do what they did in college. And a lot of NFL teams are doing that now. But I do wonder if at a certain point NFL teams will see some value in their developing players in the way they believe is best, as opposed to just leaving it up to these colleges, which aren't necessarily developing toward the NFL. Like, that's not their main goal. Their main goal is to win, right? Is to win games.
Right.
As opposed to making sure that that guy is ready to play in your league.
Well, and you know, and then this ties into what we just witnessed happen with the AAF and the XFL, right? I mean, I think it would be a great thing for college football players if there was a legitimate developmental league that could get you to the NFL, and to see both of those fail. Now, obviously, failed for different reasons, but to see both of those not make it through an entire season, I don't know if that discourages the NFL from saying, well, wouldn't this just be a money pit for us too if we tried to do this? But you wish that existed, because then I think that would actually support the world that Harbaugh wants to live in a lot better. Right.
And if there's one league that can fill a pit with money, it's the NFL. Right. I mean, if they really wanted to take on this responsibility, they absolutely could. They just choose not to. But yeah, listen, again, thanks to Coach Harbaugh for giving us something to talk about for a few days.
And for putting it in writing and being very clear. Right. I appreciate I would love to see more coaches put their proposals in writing and put it out to the world like that.
No doubt. I like having Harbaugh around. I know he gets a lot of grief for not beating Ohio State, but I like Harbaugh as part of college football.
Yeah.
Max, that was a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and I kept you for a really long time. But Max Olson from The Athletic, thanks so much for being with me today and talking some serious stuff, some not so serious stuff, and stay healthy and stay safe, Max.
Hey, chatting with you was an extremely welcome distraction, so I appreciate it, buddy.
And now, 3 and out. First down. On a personal note, I had to make a trek into Manhattan today because I needed to get something from the AP offices, which are downtown across the street from the Freedom Tower. And they are also completely empty. Everybody is working from home, and I decided I didn't want to take the subway, which are mostly pretty empty. I've gone out on them just a couple of times in the last few months. But I decided I would try to do even the safer thing and to drive to downtown to pick something up from the offices. I was strangely heartened to discover that even in a global pandemic, one of the greatest crises this country and my hometown, New York City in particular, has ever faced, I still can't find a damn parking spot in Lower Manhattan. It provided an odd sense of normalcy to pay $30 to park my car for 4 hours. Second down, more transfer news that caught my attention in the past few days. How about East Carolina and new coach Mike Houston, landing running back Chase Hayden from Arkansas and former Alabama cornerback Nigel Knott? I'm always a bit cautious, and I try to caution fans not to get too excited about transfers. I think sometimes we overvalue these players because they are new and shiny toys. Still, for an ECU program that has fallen on hard times, grabbing a couple of SEC players seems like a nice way to fill some holes. Third down. One more tip as you try to navigate the slow drip of news about what the upcoming season might look like. When you see or hear yet another headline about somebody saying something about next season, think to yourself, where is this person on the decision tree? How much influence does he or she have? How much knowledge does he or she have about what's being talked about and what is going on, not just with the pandemic, but inside college sports? How specific is the information they are giving? Have I heard this information before? Then you might be able to determine how useful that information is. And if the information is coming from a coach, I would say just be careful. Because in most cases, a coach could fall off the decision tree and not break a bone because he is so far down it. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast at Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcasts. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer for the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.